Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. I'm Jesse Hirsh. The presence of Eastern spiritual ideas amongst Western traditional thought has been making a mark in contemporary societies. So a faith that teaches inner peace and contentment through simple activities like meditation, as in Buddhism, has attracted followers of all ages from every culture, faith, and background, especially in the West. Joining me in studio to tell us how one integrates Eastern spirituality with Western traditions is Sensei Taigen Henderson, an abbot at the Toronto Zen Centre. Thanks again for coming back to our show.
You're welcome.
Now, why don't we talk a bit in terms of the work that you do here in Toronto at the Toronto Zen Centre, which I assume is balancing life here in the Western world with, you know, a mix of and literally a practice of Eastern spirituality.
Well, all of our practitioners have to practice on their own and at the Zen Centre in order to integrate what they learn on the mat, we call it, sitting in meditation, into their life. But basically, there isn't really any difference between spirituality and your regular life, and that's what they learn.
Well, and again, it must be difficult to, on the one hand, be in pursuit of a level of peace and happiness and tranquility while living in a city and a society that is often the opposite. How do you balance those two extremities?
Well, you can't pursue anything. It's really about getting rid of things. It's really about getting rid of thoughts, ideas, feelings. These are what really get in our way. And it's also about being in the now, being present, moment to moment. And this, you need to train your mind. You need to practice in order to be able to be present, to be fully present in the moment.
Well, and perhaps you could elaborate on some of the challenges that make it difficult to be in the moment, that make it difficult to really have that, I guess, that level of focus, to not be distracted by the future, by the past, by all the crazy goings-on that is Western society.
Since we're very young, we're trained, our minds are trained to be thinking machines, basically. And we're thinking machines run amok, you might say. And so at any one moment, somebody would be thinking about the future, or they'd be mulling over the past. And so they would just don't know how to control their mind. That's it in a nutshell. So what you do when you're practicing, at least practicing Zen practice, is you're learning to focus on the moment, in the moment. And then when you learn this, you can apply this to any aspect of your life.
Now, I'm interested to get to the applications, but before I kind of want to throw a curveball at you. Why is it so difficult for us to control our minds in the West? What is it that makes it so difficult for people to really do, as you say, to live in that moment and have that mental control?
What we call in Buddhism the ego I, and this is a sense of separate self. And in Buddhism, this is considered to be an illusion, that there is no separate self, that we are part of a whole humanity. We're one cell in the body of humanity. We're not separate. And this ego kind of takes control of our personality, and it wants to stay in control. So anything that we try to do to wrest control from it, such as disciplining our mind, it gives equal and opposite energy to try to steer us away from that kind of practice.
Right. And if anything, it seems the West is the worship of the ego, which is perhaps the opposite of what you described.
That's right. It's materialism and escapism. Basically, people living on the surface. But anyone who wants to live a meaningful life has to change what they do in their life in order to not be a surface liver.
Well, and you mentioned applications, the applications of when one achieves a level of mental control and lives in the now. Perhaps you could elaborate on some of those applications that, I guess, aid one in being free of the ego and really not being attached to that myth.
Right. Well, in Zen Buddhism, we call this an experience of kensho, or an awakening experience. Somebody asked the Buddha, you know, are you a god? And he said, no. He said, are you a sage? He said, no. Are you a great saint? He said, no. What are you? He said, I'm awake. And so basically that's our job, is to wake up and be in the present. And when you truly do wake up, you gain some insight into the unreality of this ego, this idea that's lodged deep in the unconscious of being a separate individuality, separate from the world, that is, separate from our fellow human beings.
Now, we have been fortunate enough to have you on our show previously, and I think we talked a little bit about this then, but I think for the benefit of our audience now, I'd be curious to hear a bit more how you yourself, clearly born in Western society, was able to, I guess, have, maybe it's the literacy, maybe it's the enlightenment to recognize that you needed to pursue that level of mental control and discipline.
I was basically a very undisciplined youth, like anyone my age, the 60s and early 70s. I was traveling around, and I just sort of took it to the end and realized actually I was hopping a freight train from out west. My legs were dangling over the car. I was totally free, and I realized this isn't true freedom.
Right.
And that was a big shock. So when I learned that that wasn't true freedom, I went for looking for what true freedom actually was.
Well, and it's interesting that, again, the West almost fetishizes freedom to the extent of it not really existing, that we grasp these illusions and myths when, in fact, real freedom is much more elusive. To what extent at the Zen Center are you able to allow people to come to that understanding, to facilitate, I guess, their initiation or introduction towards the path of, again, mental discipline and freeing oneself from all these illusions?
Well, you know, each individual has to design their own program, you might say. In fact, we have a kind of a program called a term student program where people design their own training program for a specific period of time. And everyone has to do that within their own life situation.
Sort of tailored to their needs.
Tailored to their needs, tailored to their availability to devote themselves to practice. But ultimately, you have to carve out the time in your life towards spiritual discipline. If you don't, you know, it's not magic. It requires work, but that's all it is work. And if you take time and do it, you can attain some measure of peace.
Well, thank you very much again for coming back onto our show and perhaps, I guess, hinting that people here in the West that there is an alternative in terms of the pursuit of their own freedom, that it does take a lot of work, but that work is worth it.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That was Sensei Taigen Henderson, an abbot at the Toronto Zen Centre. Next, a Japanese Buddhist practice that honors the departed spirits of one's ancestors. You're watching 3D Dialogue.